Thanks everyone for joining the June 2022 VMware TAM customer webinar. This webinar is organized by the VMware TAM organization to provide our customers the opportunity to hear great content and interact directly with great speakers that are delivering it. Our goal is to make sure that you're getting the full benefit from your software. Please make use of the Q&A feature and ask your questions there. If your questions don't get addressed today, be sure and reach out to your TAM and ask them to follow up. But before we get into today's content, there are a few items I'd like to cover. Our next TAM customer webinar will be on July 14th. And in this upcoming session, we'll be joined by a couple of our solution architects who will be discussing VMware Validated Solutions. This is VMware's technical validated implementation that is built and tested by VMware. It's to help you address common business use cases with detailed design, implementation, and operational guidance. As I mentioned earlier, we want you to benefit from these sessions by interacting with the speaker. So if you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature and we'll address them during the webinar. And at the end of today's session, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey related to the value you received from this session. And you'll also be asked to provide any topics that you'd like to see in future sessions. Your completion of the survey is a very valuable gift back to us, and we greatly appreciate you completing it. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and your TAM can make the recording link available to you. And after a few months, we'll put the recording on the VMware TAM Services YouTube public channel. That brings us to today's speaker and topic. Cato Grace is a senior technical marketing architect at VMware who specializes in availability solutions, specifically the ones we're covering today: Site Recovery Manager, vSphere Replication, and Disaster Recovery as a service offerings. That's VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery and VMware Site Recovery for VMware Cloud on AWS. Today, we'll be diving into these solutions, their use cases, some of the key features that can help you protect your workloads. And with that, Cato, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. My name's Cato Grace. And let's just dive right into it. I'm going to be covering kind of a hybrid of presentation. I'm going to try to take close to 60 minutes. But I'm going to try and cram as much information into that as I can so that you have what you need to make the best choice if you're looking for a disaster recovery solution, or if you want to make a change to your disaster recovery solution, you have a better understanding of what VMware offers. All that said, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. I will do my best. If they're applicable to what I'm talking about, I will do my best to answer them in line. And if not, I will leave time at the end for answering any of those. So the first thing, I'm imagining most of you have disaster recovery plans and you're already using some kind of a disaster recovery solution. But if you're not, you're probably aware that either not having a plan or a lot of existing manual solutions are challenging, to say the least, if not inadequate to the problem. Those challenges that we hear from customers a lot about those solutions, things like just the complexity of managing a solution, the cost of managing those solutions, and then the challenges when it comes to reliability. If we're talking especially about a manual solution, having to not being able to test it frequently, having unpredictable recovery, those kind of things. What we have from VMware is we have those three options that we kind of talked about. We've highlighted already, and I'll give you a little bit more detail about the three, and then we're going to dive into, a lot of detail, as much detail as I can cram into in, let's say 20 minutes or so for each one of these solutions, highlighting what's similar about them and what's different. So the two on the left, VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery and VMware Site Recovery, are both disaster recovery as a service offerings. And both of those are available with VMware Cloud on AWS. And when I say disaster recovery as a service, what I mean by that is that just like the rest of VMware Cloud on AWS, we offer that solution as a service. So it's not something that you as the customer have to manage and maintain as much as you normally would for an on-prem solution. And in the case of VMware Cloud DR, it's even more as a service than VMware Site Recovery. And when I get into more of the details on it, I'll highlight more of that. Now, one of the interesting things is with Site Recovery Manager used to just be on-prem only. And the things that I have highlighted on the slide where I talk about supporting things like multi-VM consistency groups and multi-writer disks, those are still an on-prem only capability. And that's because those are tied to array-based replication. But Site Recovery Manager now also will work with other hyperscalers. So if you, for whatever reason, don't want to use AWS or have any issues, or you already have an existing relationship or interest in Azure VMware solution or Google Cloud VMware Engine or even Oracle Cloud VMware solution, we're even working towards adding Alibaba Cloud as well. If you are utilizing any one of those VMware solutions on those hyperscalers, SRM will work with those solutions as well. So you can utilize those as either a protected or a recovery site or both. So there's really a lot of different options when it comes to either on-prem, you can utilize Site Recovery Manager, or once you go to the cloud, you really have a number of different options for your disaster recovery. Now, all of these solutions have a number of things in common between them. And the commonalities are that they all organize VMs into what we call protection groups. We organize those protection groups into recovery plans. The recovery plans are where you execute workflows. So things like failover, reprotect, test, clean up, those kind of things. For the as a service offerings and for Site Recovery Manager, when we go to a cloud environment, so basically for all of these solutions, when we're doing per VM level replication, we have a lot of granularity in how that recovery is set up. With Site Recovery Manager for on-prem, when you're using array-based replication, it's a little bit more challenging. When I get into some of the details about Site Recovery Manager, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But with Site Recovery Manager on-prem with array replication, we also have vVols as an option as well. Now, the big differentiator between VMware Cloud DR and VMware Site Recovery is that VMware Cloud DR provides the capability for not requiring a software-defined data center at all times. And what that means is that with VMware Cloud DR, one way to think about it is VMware Cloud DR lets you replicate your data into a scale-out cloud file system. And you don't necessarily have to have a recovery site always available for that. You're replicating your data, so your data is protected. And then in the event that you want to run a test or actually do a failover, you can deploy your SDDC at that time when you need it, and then tear it down when you don't need it. And so it has some cost optimizations to it. In addition to that, VMware Cloud DR also easily supports a pilot light option, where you could have, if you want your recovery to be a little bit faster, because obviously there's some time that goes into deploying an SDDC, If you want your recovery to be a little bit faster, you could have a pilot light. So you could have a 2-host SDDC sitting there ready and running all the time. And in the event that you want to run a test or a failover, you just scale up that SDDC instead of actually deploying it. Now with VMware Site Recovery, we have more of a performance optimized solution. So you're going to always, with VMware Site Recovery, you would always have an SDDC deployed. And since currently storage in VMware Cloud on AWS is tied to vSAN, it's a little bit less flexible in terms of being able to scale up and scale down. So depending on what your storage requirements are, you may have to have a particular number of hosts with VMware Site Recovery deployed all the time to support the storage requirements of what you're replicating into VMware Site Recovery. So the big thing to think about with those two is VMware Cloud DR is a little bit more cost optimized. And we say that it provides good RPO, and that means that we can do RPOs as low as 30 minutes. With VMware Site Recovery, we're more performance optimized, and therefore we offer better RPOs. So RPOs as low as 5 minutes. And then in addition to that, VMware Site Recovery will provide a faster recovery as well, so shorter RTO in addition to RPO. And then Site Recovery Manager on-prem is VMware's on-prem disaster recovery solution. And Site Recovery Manager, VMware Site Recovery is actually built using Site Recovery Manager and vSphere Replication. So underlying those two is the same solution. However, on-prem Site Recovery Manager we have more options when it comes to things like array replication, which gives you access to multi-VM consistency groups, multi-writer disks, things like that. With Site Recovery Manager, you have multiple replication options on-prem. You can use vSphere replication, array replication, vVol replication. And again, we'll dive into those in a little bit more detail here shortly. And please, if there are any questions as I'm going through this, please ask those. I'm trying to put a lot of content into a kind of a quick presentation, and so hopefully I'm not losing anybody, but really, if you have questions, I would much rather this be a little interactive than just me talking at you. So let's first take a little closer look at VMware Site Recovery. So first off, looking at the architecture for VMware Site Recovery. So VMware Site Recovery supports flexible vCenter options. So you don't have to have you don't have to use a particular version. I mean, I should say you can use any vCenter version. There are multiple vCenter versions that you can use for your on-prem solution. So yeah, so oh, cool. Whole bunch of questions just popped in there. So what does cloud to cloud mean? Cloud to cloud mean? By cloud to cloud, what I'm talking about is going to and from VMware Cloud on AWS instances. And so obviously those could be in different locations. You could, different, if you wanted to, you could do different availability zones within the same region, or you can do, between regions that are both offering VMware Cloud on AWS. One of the other things that we are currently working on as well is currently VMware Site Recovery would just be either on-prem to VMware Cloud on AWS or between VMware Cloud on AWS instances. We're currently working on supporting VMware Cloud going from Azure VMware solution to VMware Cloud on AWS, so offering a true multi-cloud solution. Yeah, good question. Another one. So what's the difference between Site Recovery Manager and VMware Site Recovery? So really the main difference between those two is that VMware Cloud on AWS, VMware Site Recovery is part of VMware Cloud on AWS. So it's really offered as a service. And what all that means is that if you're using VMware Cloud on AWS as your recovery site, then if you're familiar with the idea of VMware Cloud on AWS, you know that we offer that as a data center, as a software-defined data center as a service solution. So you don't have admin access to that site. You're just you're consuming the resources, but you don't have to deal with the management, the maintenance, those kind of details related to that SDDC. And so when you layer VMware Site Recovery on top of that, it's the same idea. VMware takes care of deploying, managing, maintaining the Site Recovery Manager and vSphere application appliances. You as the customer would be responsible for managing and maintaining those on-prem, but within the VMware Cloud on AWS environment, we would manage and maintain those. And then again, from a licensing standpoint, it's again offered like that service. So you would only pay for it when you use it, as opposed to purchasing a permanent license, and that you have that permanent license and you utilize that on-prem all the time, as opposed to just when you need it in the cloud. Hopefully that makes sense. And then yeah, John had a question, in the VSR column, you have on-prem to cloud and cloud to cloud. Cloud to on-prem is, yes, that is also an option. So you can go, the direction that you can go is, you can go in either direction. So you could run your production workloads within VMware Cloud on AWS and protect those to your on-prem site, or go the other way, or go cloud to cloud. And then Jorg had a question, what about Cloud Director Service? I'm guessing you're talking about vCloud Director. If you're looking for failover for vCloud Director, that solution would be VMware Cloud Availability, and that's out of my scope for talking about today. But I can potentially point you at some resources if that's of interest. So you'll notice with VMware Site Recovery, we have the same basic infrastructure at both sites. We need a vCenter at both sites. We need vSphere hosts, and then we have some kind of underlying storage. Now within VMware Cloud on AWS, those things are managed and maintained and deployed by VMware. So you'll notice there's no versions or anything to that, because that's kind of outside of what you as the customer would need to think about. On-prem, there are some requirements about like versions of vCenter, but it's flexible. You don't have to have the exact same version of vCenter that you're running within VMware Cloud on AWS on-prem. And then from a storage standpoint, it's also flexible. You can utilize any storage that's supported by VMware on-prem. And since we're using vSphere application to replicate that, you can go from any storage into the storage that we're using on VMware Cloud on AWS. Let's see, Nirdesh has a question about Oracle needing extra licenses for Oracle VMs during DR in case of VMC. That's more of an Oracle licensing question. I'm not really able to answer that. I don't know if anybody else has some information on that, but usually most vendors in the case of disaster recovery, and even in the case of testing, support running that, utilizing that same license, like not requiring a different license for disaster recovery. So, but we are talking about Oracle here, so that what's reasonable and normal may not apply. So, and then does it require vSphere application? So VMware Site Recovery does utilize vSphere application. That's the replication solution. And again, the vSphere Application Appliance and Site Recovery Manager appliances that are deployed within VMware Cloud on AWS, those are, again, managed and maintained by VMware. Really easy to deploy those into that environment as well. It's just you activate the service and then they're automatically deployed. For the on-prem site, you would need to download and deploy those two appliances. But again, those are just standard OVF deployments, nothing complicated, nothing challenging in getting those installed and set up. And then from there, you're able to pair up those systems and start protecting and organizing the protection of your VMs. From a topology standpoint, I just wanted to highlight that with VMware Site Recovery, there's multiple things that you can do. You can utilize VMware Site Recovery alongside Site Recovery Manager. So if you have an on-prem site that you're currently protecting some VMs to other, one or more other on-prem sites, you could also protect some of your other VMs into VMware Cloud on AWS. And keep in mind, these arrows can go in either direction. So you could also, have be running VMs in VMware Cloud on AWS and protecting those VMs to your on-prem location as well. And then you can also have, that was kind of like a fan out option. You can also have a fan in option where you have, multiple sites, either on-prem or cloud sites, failing over to a single VMware Cloud on AWS site. And one of the things that I always try to highlight is that really for any of these cloud solutions, so this applies to all three of the solutions that I'm talking about today. For VMware, for Site Recovery Manager, this applies specifically to the hyperscaler use case, when we're using it with an AVS or GCVE, that kind of thing. But you have the ability to do something with the cloud that it's really impossible to do on-prem. So one of the options is, if it works for you from a storage standpoint, you can run your tier 1 workloads, or say tier 1, tier 2 at your on-site location, and run that environment in a, run close to capacity. So you're running, run at whatever 80%, whatever your normal capacity that you consider, run your environment at that level on-prem. And then within VMware Cloud on AWS, you have an environment where, again, from a CPU and memory standpoint, you run that close to capacity, running your tier 3 and tier 4 workloads. And then in the event of a disaster, you have a problem, you scale out dynamically that VMware Cloud on AWS environment, and you scale it up to the point where you support all of those workloads. And again, that's not something that obviously it's not something that you could do on-prem, where you couldn't, you can't have a data center magically grow. Buying additional servers, getting them installed and racked and whatever, takes time. And so that is something that you can do with when you have the cloud as your recovery site. Greg had a question, and I'll get to this a little bit more when we talk more in detail about Site Recovery Manager, but the failover granularity is available with SRM when using array replication. So, is it possible to protect individual VMs? So with array replication, you're tied to the granularity of the array. So usually with arrays, you're replicating LUNs or potentially a consistency group. However, one of the other options with array replication is vVol replication. And with vVol replication, that you can actually take down to the individual VM, and it's not tied to, vVols are replicated at the VM level. So that gives you that array that per VM granularity. Hopefully that makes sense. And again, I'll dive into that a little bit more when we talk specifically about Site Recovery Manager. And James asked, does this work with linked clones, and I'm not sure if we're talking VMware Site Recovery or VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. Really, vSphere Replication doesn't work with linked clones. So if you're looking to protect linked clones, that would be something that would require array replication. Hopefully that answers your question. So really quick, talking about, and maybe this would help, talking about what vSphere Replication can do, and I'll try and throw in some of the things that it's not able to do as well, just so you're aware of those. So vSphere Replication is per VM level replication. Now vSphere Replication works with both VMware Site Recovery, and it's also an option with Site Recovery Manager. And just so you know, vSphere Replication is included with Essentials Plus licensing and higher. So I can almost guarantee you that all of you already have access to vSphere Replication. The vSphere Replication is just the moving of the VM's data. It's not SRM and VSR, and really VCDR as well, add the orchestration on top of vSphere Replication. So if you're just looking to move a couple of VMs, vSphere Replication is a great solution. But by itself, it's a little bit more challenging to use, just because it's just moving the VM. And I'll talk a little bit more about what orchestration adds into it. But again, the really cool thing with vSphere Replication, since it's not tied to underlying storage, it supports any storage that vSphere supports. So local, file, block, vvol, vSAN, whatever, your VMs, whatever your storage you're using and wherever storage you're going to, as long as they're both supported by vSphere, you can use them with vSphere Replication. And then vSphere Replication supports a number of really cool capabilities as well. If you need to trade a little bit of bandwidth for, or you want to trade some CPU for some bandwidth, you can utilize network compression. If you have security concerns, you can encrypt vSphere Replication's traffic. You can also replicate encrypted VMs. From a ransomware recovery standpoint, or database corruption, things like that, we also support multiple point-in-time recovery, where you have the ability to roll back to a particular point in time with vSphere Replication. And then it also supports quiescing. So if you have applications that need a level of quiescing, we support that as well. Now, really quick, before I get into that, some of the limitations of vSphere Replication. So vSphere Replication does not support physical RDMs. It also does not support multi-VM consistency groups. So if you have a group of VMs that need to be like a database cluster, something like that, that need to be replicated together, vSphere Replication does not support that. It doesn't support multi-writer disks. And yeah, I think those are the main limitations that I just wanted to highlight. See, Ethan had a question. Can we go into encryption and on-prem only versus local to cloud? If you have a more of a question there, I'm not sure what more you'd want me to get into. We're talking vSphere Replication in particular here. So vSphere Replication supports both on-prem to cloud, as well as cloud to cloud, as well as on-prem to on-prem. And traffic encryption is just one of the capabilities that vSphere Replication has, and you can utilize it in any of those different environments. If that didn't answer your question, Ethan, please feel free to add some more detail. So vSphere VMware Site Recovery has multiple options when it comes to the ability to customize the IP addresses at your recovery site. So as far as recovery goes, there's a number of different things that we can do to get your VMs up and running the way that they need to be at the recovery site. And one of those things is customizing IP addresses. And the IP customization can be done in a couple of different ways. The standard way that most people would expect is, we can just do per VM IP customization, where each VM is just, the IP address is just changing to a different IP address at the recovery site. We can also do mapping, subnet mapping. So you can see that we have, 2 different network ranges at the protected site and at the recovery site. And when we handle that, we change the network portion of the address, but we leave the host portion of the address the same. And the nice thing with that is that is just by having that VM associated with the network map, the IP address would automatically be changed. So you don't have to configure it at a per VM basis. So Ed had a question about IP customization, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit. We were talking about vSphere Replication, and now we're talking about IP customization. So IP customization is a function of Site Recovery Manager or VMware Site Recovery. It's not something that's tied to vSphere Replication. Again, vSphere Replication is just the replication solution itself. And then Scott had a question, and Scott, Scott had a question about, I mentioned that vSphere Replication doesn't support a few of those things. And so Scott was asking about, how would you recover a multi-writer disk, an MS SQL or something like that, if vSphere Replication doesn't support it. So if we're talking about protecting it to the cloud, so if your only option is vSphere Replication, one of the ways that we've seen customers protect a multi-writer system is protecting just, let's see, what was one of those ways, is usually the way that would work is you'd want to utilize like the application level availability for that. So, do something like log shipping, or I can't remember the other Microsoft specific capabilities. But you can utilize something like that to protect those if vSphere Replication is your only option. If we're talking on-prem, if you have array replication as an option, so you're going on-prem to on-prem and you can utilize array replication or vVol replication, those both support multi-writer disks. So that's how that would work. Okay, and then Mark had a question, when using vSphere Replication to replicate all the mounted file systems of a particular VM, is there any special coordination for database residing on that VM? So vSphere Replication is consistent across all the disks of a VM. So if a VM has multiple disks, vSphere Replication will replicate all of those disks in a consistent state. If that answers your question. I think that was what you were asking, Mark, but if not, let me know. And then Ed had the question, is by multi-writer disk, is that like an MS cluster? Yes, that's a cluster. You have to configure a disk for multi-writer when you want multiple VMs to be able to write to the same disk at the same time, which is the requirement of an MS cluster or Linux cluster, those kind of things. Okay, so the process for deploying and setting up VMware Site Recovery is really simple. You just enable VMware Site Recovery within VMware Cloud on AWS, configure the firewall, you download and deploy the vSphere Application and Site Recovery Manager appliances on-prem, and then at that point you're ready to just pair those sites, get the resources mapped, and then start replicating and protecting your VMs. So that is kind of that was a quick run through of VMware Site Recovery. Let's talk a little bit now about VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, and then I'll wrap things up with a discussion of Site Recovery Manager. So VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, we have our on-prem site with our, you've got your VMs and your data stores. And then we have our VMware managed portion of our environment. And the VMware managed portion of it is going to include that scale out cloud file system, which is what I was talking about before. The idea of this is that this is one of the main things that VMware got from the Datrium acquisition, is this scale out cloud file system technology. So this is sitting on top of cloud storage, but it's a VMware designed, VMware engineered cloud storage that provides an ability to have hundreds or thousands of snapshots of your VMs, of the VM's data within that scale out cloud file system. Because we're not talking about traditional vSphere snapshots, we have a lot more flexibility when it comes to how we retain that data. And then the scale out cloud file system as well is immutable. So from a ransomware standpoint, it provides both a lot of points that you can roll back to, and it also is a system that can't be easily changed or disrupted as part of an issue that you would potentially have with ransomware. The other aspect of the solution is the SaaS orchestrator. And so this is the orchestration engine for recovery and for managing that recovery process. So both of those solutions are cloud-based and VMware managed. So that's you as the customer don't have to think about either one of those. Those are things that VMware takes care of. They're not tied to your SDDC or anything like that. So all you would have is you would deploy on-prem what we call the DRaaS connector. Again, that's just a simple OVA or OVF deployment. You get that set up, and then that's what will handle the replication into that scale out cloud file system. And then the SaaS orchestrator is where you would go in to manage and configure your recovery and your protection, things like that. So then on an as needed basis, you can deploy an SDDC. So you don't have to have an SDDC always deployed. You can have one deployed as like a pilot light, but you don't have to always have that there and available. When you do utilize it, so if you're running a test or if you're actually needing to run a failover, you have an option, what we call live mount. So what you're able to do is you're actually able to mount that scale out cloud file system. It will mount as an NFS data store. You can mount that into your SDDC, and that lets you either, in the case of a test, you could run the entirety of the test with your VMs on that scale out cloud file system. And that just saves you time of moving all of that data from the scale out cloud file system into your SDDC. Or in the case of a disaster, you have in the case of a disaster, your VMs will come up on the scale out cloud file system, but VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery will actually automatically start moving those VMs into your SDDC as part of that failover process. So your VMs, you have the best of both worlds. Your VMs come up quickly, and then as soon as possible, they also move on to that SDDC storage so that they get the best performance possible. So we have that, instant power on. The VMs come on right away because we can run them from that scale out cloud file system when we need to. And then when we get to the place where we're failing back, we're just going to be replicating back whatever has changed since those VMs were running within VMware Cloud on AWS. We don't have to, it's not like a complete replication back to your on-prem site. So some of the other things that are pretty cool with VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery is organizing VMs into protection groups is really flexible. We have a number of different policies that we can utilize for that. So we can create policies for how we organize those VMs in based on the VM name, based on what folder a VM is located in, how that VM is tagged. Any of those options we can utilize for how those VMs are going to get protected. Scheduling is really flexible as well. So you can set the frequency and timing desired for each of those replication protection points. We can set those protection points as low as 30 minutes. And then you can have multiple schedules so that you can cover different ranges of both near-term and longer-term SLAs. So, you could have a schedule that says, I want to protect this protection group, kind of similar to your backup scheduling. You could say, I want to replicate this VM, every 30 minutes for a day, and then I want to retain, 5 backups per day for a week, and then, 1 backup per week for a month, and then 1 backup per month for a year. However you want to do that, you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to how you do that. Let's see, Scott had a question. Is the failback replication based on egress costing? So there would be, I believe there are egress costs. I don't know how you would calculate those, but it would just be for whatever data has changed since you did the initial failover. So it's not, there's not additional, anything extra that you would have to pay for there. I don't know, hopefully that answers that question. Yeah, so you have, from configuring a protection group, you have multiple options in how we select VMs, how we schedule, and then how we retain those. Those can be tied to, tied into at different levels. And then when we think about disaster, the actual recovery plan, so we group it out. We have the scope. So you think about what sites are going to be covered, what protection groups. We're going to create mappings. I didn't talk about this a lot in detail when we were talking about VMware Site Recovery, but all 3 of these solutions have this idea of mappings. And the idea there is that since we are moving VMs from one vCenter to another vCenter, these solutions are going to need to know how the resources map between those two. So, in vCenter A, you have a VM that's located in a particular folder. It's in a particular resource pool. It's connected to a particular network, particular storage policy. So when we move that VM to the other vCenter, we need, same idea. We're going to need to make sure that we have that configured. We know how those resources map, so we know where to connect that VM once we move it. Hamza had a question. Yeah, so how does the pay-as-you-go model differ between VSR and VCDR? Good question. So with VMware Site Recovery, the way that that's licensed is that's per replicated VM. So it's a cost per minute per replicated VM. With VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, I believe the way that that is licensed is based on storage consumption. So the amount of data that you store within VMware Cloud on AWS, or sorry, VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. The best, I am not an expert on pricing, so the best place to go for information on both of those would be to take a look at the really the pricing page for both of those sites. And if you have any trouble finding that, I can point you at it. Hopefully that answers that question. And then Mark had another question about databases. So if the database is being replicated separately by an external system, data guard always on, SRM therefore only has to replicate any dependent VMs and their mounted volumes. Could we describe examples where SRM handles? Okay, so yeah, Mark is wondering how SRM and really how any of these solutions can integrate with kind of an external system. We have so they are all capable of doing that, and the way that that would be handled is scripting. So all of these solutions have the capability in one way or another of running scripts as part of the recovery plan. And so that can be a way that those systems can tie into external systems. And for Oracle, like for DataGuard, and I believe for SQL as well, we have some white papers that our application team has put out specifically about those solutions, highlighting, I think they may even have some of those scripts published as part of those papers that show how to handle that integration. So, and see, so Ed has the question, can you run scripts in Power CLI? So it, for different solutions, we have different options. So yes, you can run with Power CLI. With Site Recovery Manager, we have two options for how we run scripts. You can either run a script on the SRM server itself, in which case, if we're talking about SRM, if you run the script on the server itself, SRM, since we moved it to an appliance, only supports Bash, Python, and Perl. However, you also have the option of running a script on a recovered VM. So you could have what somebody named, and I think it's kind of appropriate, you can utilize what we call either a script VM or a mule VM, where that VM comes up first, and then you run whatever scripts you need on that VM. And obviously that VM could be any kind of a VM. It could be a Windows, Linux, whatever. And so if you wanted to run Power CLI, you have a Windows VM, it comes up and handles running those scripts. So hopefully that answers that question. Again, if I haven't already said it, thank you very much for asking all of these questions. Again, I'd much rather this be a little bit interactive and you guys walk away with the information that you want than me just talking at you. So thanks again for that. So in addition to the mappings, we have our customizations. Those can be IP addresses, or as we were just talking about, scripts. Those scripts can be, again, handled on the scripting VM, or in the case of SRM, we also have the option of running those on the SRM server itself. And then we can define our sequencing. So what order we want those VMs to come up in, how we want those VMs to come up, et cetera. And then, we can tie in any alerts and things like that. So thinking about, specifically about those recovery steps, we can organize those VMs with VMware Cloud DR. You can organize those VMs and how they're recovered by protection group, individual VMs. If you have, special actions that you want for particular VMs, you don't want to power on certain VMs, or you want, other VMs to wait for a particular other thing to happen before they power on, things like that. One other thing that I want to highlight with for all of these solutions when it comes to powering on VMs from that, the orchestration standpoint, is that all of these solutions are, when we say that they power on a VM, they're not just powering on the VM and then considering that VM to be powered on. They're powering it on, and then they wait for VM tools heartbeats to respond. And only after VM tools heartbeats respond do they consider that VM up and running and ready, for whatever the next step is. So hopefully that makes sense. So at this point, I am going to switch over to, give me just a second here. I'm going to switch over, and we are going to briefly talk about, I've got about 10 minutes left, I think, no, 8 minutes. We're going to walk through a bit about Site Recovery Manager. So with Site Recovery, and the main thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the differences of Site Recovery Manager compared with VMware Cloud DR or VMware Site Recovery. So one of the biggest differences, I mean, you'll notice that from a architectural standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, we have the same basic configuration. We have our vCenter, we have our hosts, we have our storage. So again, we're going to layer on top of that Site Recovery Manager, vSphere application. Where things get a little different is if we're going to use array-based replication, we would install what's called an SRA, or storage replication adapter, into our SRM servers. And that is just a way for SRM to communicate with the storage array and have, because it's going to be heavily dependent on that storage array to handle the recovery, we need that communication. If we're using, one of the things that's pretty cool is that if you're using vVols, you actually are using array replication, but you don't have to utilize a storage replication adapter. So again, with SRM on-prem, we have multiple replication options. We've got, vSphere replication, array-based replication, or vVol replication. Now, I think that vVol replication is the coolest option. And that's really because you get a lot of the benefits of vSphere replication and the benefits of array replication. So with vVol replication, you do have to have, compatible arrays. You need arrays that support vVol, the vVol spec and vVol replication and all of that. But what you're able to do is you're able to have your replication groups be as granular as a single VM. And then, those VMs could be, and that would tie into your protection group as well. But you're able to have those replication groups be as small as a single VM. It's really easy to move VMs in and out of protection and between protection groups. So vVols just is, if you're not familiar with vVols, I highly recommend learning a little bit more about that. And there's, a number of details that me and my colleague that works on virtual volumes have put together about SRM and working with vVols, things like that. Other option is vSphere replication. We've already talked about the capabilities there. Array replication, though, is let's see. So I've got a few questions about vVols. So at the end, I will try to grab a couple of resources to point you all at. I don't have those right at my fingertips, so I can't just paste those into the chat right now, but I will grab a couple of resources and make sure that you have all of those. And then, array-based replication, obviously we're utilizing that storage array. And what that really looks like, Dan had a question, this is a good one. So using vSAN means that you're using vSphere application. That is correct. Yeah, if you're using vSAN, the option for vSAN is to use vSphere application. So one other thing that I just wanted to highlight for array replication in particular is array replication, and this is without using vvols. This is just standard array replication. So array replication supports, we're just utilizing the underlying array technology to replicate our VMs. And so we're tied into that underlying technology. So you can see in the example here, we have, whether we're replicating individual LUNs like LUN 4 and LUN 5, or we're replicating, a group of LUNs in a consistency group, our protection groups are going to be tied directly to those. So the VMs that are located on data store A, B, and C, those VMs have to be part of protection group 1. So that's one of the challenges with array replication. With vvol replication, we have the flexibility that, as long as the VM is on that vvol, it can be organized into whatever replication group that we want. And then with vSphere replication, again, we're not tied to that underlying storage, so we can just organize those VMs in whatever way that we want. So those are really the main differences between Site Recovery Manager and VMware Site Recovery. Now, the one other thing, one other difference from a licensing standpoint is if you're using Site Recovery Manager for hyperscalers, so if you're using Site Recovery Manager to go to a AVS, GCVE, OCVS, we currently do require a different license. It's a term license as opposed to a permanent license. So that's something to just be aware of if you're looking to utilize those. And anyway, that licensing always, I always find licensing a little bit more challenging and hard for me to get into, but if you have more questions about that, I can do my best to answer those. Some of the other things with really all of these solutions, but more specific to Site Recovery Manager and VMware Site Recovery, is with those solutions, we can organize our VMs into priority groups. So what Site Recovery Manager will do is it will power on all of the VMs that are in a particular priority group first, and then it'll move on to the next priority group. So in this case, we'd first power on our master database. Next, we would power on both our secondary database and our BI. Once both of those solutions are up and VM tools responding, then we move on to our next priority group. We power on Ecom 1, and then one of the other things that we can do is if we need more granularity, we can add an additional a dependency within that and say that Ecom 2 is dependent on Ecom 1. Again, tying all of this back into the making sure that our VMs power on in the way that we want them to in our environment. One of the last things that I wanted to talk about just briefly is how we handle testing being non-disruptive. So with all of these solutions, we have the ability to non-disruptively test our disaster recovery. So you can do it in a way that is non-disruptive to your on-prem systems, which is really important when it comes down, if you want the ability to frequently test your recovery, you're going to want to be able to do that non-disruptively. And the way that you're able to do that is we have our replicas at the recovery site. And so what we do when we run a test from a storage standpoint is we're just going to take a VM snapshot of that replica disk, and we'll use that snapshot to run our test. And that way there's no impact to replication, no change in RPO, everything just continues working as we expected it to. And then from a networking standpoint, the thing that we're able to do is, we talked before about the mappings, and with those mappings, what we can do is we just create an additional mapping for our test network, so that when you run a test, instead of the VMs getting connected to the production network and ending up with duplicate VMs, you run that test and your VMs are isolated on their own test network. And Site Recovery Manager has a couple of different options for dealing with that. So, and Mark had a good question about the test networks. How would you deal with access to other basic services like AD, DNS, things like that? So the way that I would recommend dealing with that is, what you would do is, you're going to have those, I like to think of them as like tier 0 systems running at your recovery site all the time. So those are going to be things like your, AD, DNS, stuff like that. So those tier 0 services are running at your recovery site all the time. When you run a test, what you would want to do is you'd want to clone those systems. And maybe it's just one VM, or maybe it's a couple, but you clone those VMs and you place them into that isolated test network along with your test VMs. And that way, when you run that test, you're getting an actual real test of what your recovery would look like. Those VMs are going to be, when you run an actual failover, those VMs would be talking to that same AD and DNS server, communicating with them in the same way. You'd want to set up your test network to be a duplicate of your production network, and just have that be set up in a way where it's isolated from the rest of your environment. So those are kind of the main differences between Site Recovery Manager, VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, and VMware Site Recovery. And yeah, so Ed was just commenting that that's why he was looking for SRM to run a script. And yeah, and that's a perfect use case for SRM running that script. And there's even ways that you can, within the scripting technology for SRM, there's even ways that you can have that script work on only run that script, or have that script detect if it's running when SRM is running in a test mode as opposed to a failover mode. And that script can determine that and then only run when it uses that. And Ed also asked us if there's VRO integration. Yes, SRM has integration with VRO. Let's see, Joseph asked a question, why can't we snapshot the AD DNS VMs as well? I mean, you could, well, the thing that you want to do is you want to clone them and place them into that test bubble. So you basically, you don't want, you want to keep that test environment isolated, because that test environment they're copies of your production VMs. And so you don't want any, like an actual user talking to a test VM and thinking that they're talking to an actual, the actual production VM. Yeah. And then Ed was just saying snapshotting and reverting a DC is a bad thing. I would agree with that. Like you don't want to, I wouldn't recommend failing over an AD server just because AD has its own availability built into it, and that availability works really well. So hopefully that all makes sense. I know we talked about a whole bunch of different things today. There are a lot of similarities between these three solutions, and there are a lot of differences. Hopefully this gave you at least some rough guidelines of some things to think about. The cloud options are really cool when it comes to their ability to really their flexibility. Being able to have scalability options, not being tied to your recovery site always being the same size. We've got, multiple options. Let's see, David had a question, SRM being able to use a single vCenter. That's something that we have looked at, but, and David, if you could reach out through your TAM, if you have like a specific use case that you're looking at for that, we've heard some interest in it, but when you think about it from a disaster recovery standpoint, like you kind of need a vCenter at your recovery site. So yeah, anyway, be interested to, PM would be interested in hearing a little bit more about that. So you'd rather use vCenter HA, but from what I understand, vCenter HA doesn't work for long distances. But anyway, we could have that discussion and get you in touch with the PM. So Joseph asked the question, which of the three solutions is more expensive? Yeah, standard consulting answer applies there. It depends. It's going to depend on what. God, I mean, that's just going to depend on a whole bunch of different things. We're talking CapEx versus OpEx in the case of as a service versus on-prem. Of the cloud solutions, VMware Cloud DR is less expensive than VMware Site Recovery. But again, there's trade-offs. You're trading a more cost optimized for a higher RPO and a higher RTO. So yeah, it really depends. But that is definitely something that you could explore with your account team and talk to them more and get more information on that. And I know there was a question there, and I'm pretty sure I answered it about VRO. SRM does have and vSphere Replication both have VRO management packs. One other thing that I just wanted to give you all I guess a heads up about. I'm assuming most of you, all of you, are on have NDAs, but in the next release of Site Recovery Manager, we're working on REST APIs for Site Recovery Manager and vSphere Application. So Lakshan had a question. How is VMware making replica disk in the cloud? I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to there. If you're talking about from a testing standpoint, if you are talking about from a test, what we do is we just do a VM snapshot. So that's that's kind of how that works. If you're talking about something else, I am not. Give me a little bit more detail, and I will try to answer that. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. Happy to answer any more questions if you have them.
Yeah, thanks, Cato. Do you have more content to cover here?
No, I mean, I can talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about, but that's I'm kind of at my wrap up point.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to answer questions. We just had a few more.
Yeah, cool.
Roll in here.
Sweet. Yeah, so using vSAN. So if you're using vSAN, your only option with vSAN is to utilize vSphere replication. So yeah, vSAN doesn't, the array replication equivalent for vSAN is vSphere replication, not vVols. vVols is something that's tied to array replication. And then Okay, so the cloud does not have snapshots, just continued replica images. And any one of those can be used for a snapshot for DR. So I think, Lakshan, I think you're asking, I'm guessing you're asking about VMware Cloud DR. And if that's the case, yeah, so VMware Cloud DR, the way that works is the scale out cloud file system keeps track of, it's what's handling the versioning, the snapshots, and it's not, those are not VMware snapshots. Those are, you know, I can't remember, the log-based snapshots. So it's, you know, it's keeping track of how the system changes and you know, how that works, how it changes and evolves over time, and all of those different changes and which ones you want to retain and things like that. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but maybe I'm not fully understanding that. Yeah. Thanks for the comments. Yeah, similar. You know, you have that ability to roll back to any of those previous points in time. So. Cool. Thanks again for all the questions, all the interaction. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everybody for all your time. Like I mentioned before, if you have more questions, you know, please reach out to your account team. Yeah, always happy to help. So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cato. This was really great content today, and I can tell from the feedback here that we're getting in the Q&A for sure. So really appreciate you being here and presenting this information to us.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Yeah. So with that, I guess I'll just wrap everything up. If you think of some questions that you want to ask, definitely reach out to your TAM to get those questions answered. So as we mentioned at the beginning, this was recorded. Your TAM can make the recording available to you. Please join us next month when we'll be looking at VMware Validated Solutions. We look forward to seeing you for that on July 14th. So with that, this concludes the webinar. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.